All right, UPSC aspirants, ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something you'll definitely see on your mains exam, and probably prelims too, the Indian Ocean.
It's perfect timing, actually, with the 8th Indian Ocean Conference going on right now in Muscat. Around 30 countries are there just to talk about this region. It's not just some body of water, it's a major geopolitical hotspot.
Yeah, it's like the Indian Ocean is suddenly front page news, and for good reason. But here's a little trivia. Did you know the Indian Ocean is the only ocean named after a country?
It really is the only one. All the others get their names from mythology or, geographic features. But the Indian Ocean, that name, it's proof of how powerful ancient Indian civilization was and how much influence it had all over the region for centuries.
So we're not just talking about, currents and maps here. We're talking ancient Indian empires, trade routes across the ocean, cultural exchange. This is history that's still affecting India's role in the world today. So where do we even start?
Well, if you really want to understand just how powerful India was back then, we got to go way back. I'm talking about Kautilya's Arthashastra. This text is super old from the 4th century BCE, and get this, it actually lays out the rules for how to run ports.
Wait, are you serious? They had port commissioners and harbor masters way back then?
Absolutely. And what's interesting for us today is that Kautilya saw ports as important both for the economy and for strategy. That same double focus is really important to India's maritime strategy today, don't you think?
For sure. It's like they knew how powerful the ocean was even back then. And it wasn't just about the rules and bureaucracy, right? There's proof they had booming trade and cultural connections all over the Indian Ocean.
Think about Fahian, that Chinese traveler. In the 5th century CE, he sailed from Sri Lanka to Indonesia with 200 Burmatical merchants. That really shows you how far India's reach was both for trade and for culture.
Wow, that's amazing. But here's something I've always wondered. If India was such a big maritime power, what happened? Why don't we talk about a huge Indian naval empire the way we talk about the British or the Portuguese empires?
That's a great question, and honestly, understanding that turning point is key to understanding how India sees the Indian Ocean today. Here's the thing, as India's economic power got weaker, so did its control of the sea. And then when European powers started rising in the second millennium, well, the Indian Ocean basically became their playground for colonization.
That historical legacy brings up a really important question for India today. How do you balance that continental mindset with the need for maritime power? Because let's be honest, even with such a long coastline, India's shipbuilding industry isn't really that great globally.
It's like there was this continental mindset where land-based defense was more important than maritime power. That's what diplomat K.M. Panikkar argued in his 1945 book, India and the Indian Ocean. He warned about this and said the sea is super important for India's future, but unfortunately people didn't really pay attention to what he said back then.
Makes you think, what if they had listened back then? How different would India's maritime strategy be today?
Yeah, it's hard to say, but what we can do is learn from it, and those lessons are especially important now because the Indian Ocean is more strategically important than ever.
Yeah, it's like the whole world suddenly realized, hey, that giant body of water is kind of important for global trade.
More than kinda important, think about it, all the critical supply chains, so much of the world's container traffic, it all goes through the Indian Ocean.
And for India, it's even more vital, right?
Oh, absolutely. A huge 80% of India's external trade and 90% of its energy needs all depend on the Indian Ocean. Those are some numbers no UPSC aspirant can ignore.
It really shows you how geography and economics are completely tied to each other. And then when you add in geopolitics, well, things get really interesting. You talked about the Indo-Pacific earlier. What does that even mean, and why should our listeners care?
It's a term that's been getting a lot of attention lately. It basically means that the Indian and Pacific Oceans are strategically linked. They're not just separate bodies of water anymore. It's like one giant chessboard where all the major powers are competing for influence.
Okay, so who are the players in this game? Obviously India, but who else is making moves in the Indian Ocean?
Well, the United States has been there for a long time with their base in Diego Garcia, France, still has influence with Reunion Island. And then there's China. They've been putting a lot of money into developing ports and infrastructure all over the region.
Ah, China. That name always gets people talking, especially when it comes to their intentions. Some people say it's just economic development. Others say it's a power play. What do you think about China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean?
That's a tough one, honestly. There are a lot of different opinions. Some analysts say it's just them trying to secure trade routes and energy resources. Others are worried about China's military getting stronger there and what that could mean for the balance of power. What's important for UPSC aspirants is to be able to look at all these different perspectives and understand what they could mean for India's security and foreign policy.
So how is India responding to all of this? It sounds like there's a lot at stake.
India, under Prime Minister Modi, has a pretty clear goal to become a leading blue water power. Now, for those who don't know what that means, it basically means being able to project naval power anywhere in the open ocean, not just along the coast.
So like aircraft carrier submarines, the whole deal. But becoming a blue water power takes more than just a strong military might.
Of course, it's about a whole approach that includes diplomacy, economic partnerships, and building strong alliances, and that's where the SAGAR initiative comes in.
Okay, tell us more about SAGAR. What's the main idea?
SAGAR stands for Security and Growth for All in the Region. It started in 2015, and it shows that India wants to be more active in making sure the whole Indian Ocean region is secure and prosperous.
So it's about working together, not just competing. But what does SAGAR actually do? How does it work in practice?
It's a multi-pronged approach. You've got capacity building for the smaller island nations, joint military exercises with partner countries, humanitarian aid and disaster relief operations, and promoting economic cooperation through trade and investment. The big takeaway here is that India isn't just looking out for itself. They're trying to create an environment where everyone benefits.
That makes sense. But let's be honest, the Indian Ocean isn't exactly a peaceful paradise. There are some serious challenges there, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, you've got piracy, maritime terrorism, climate change, illegal fishing, human trafficking, the list goes on.
And these challenges tie directly into a lot of the UPSC syllabus topics: internal security, environmental issues, international relations. It's like a perfect storm of interconnected problems.
Exactly. Think about it, understanding how climate change affects coastal communities in the Indian Ocean region that's directly relevant to your UPSC prep. Same thing with analyzing India's role in fighting piracy or promoting maritime security that's crucial for understanding India's foreign policy goals.
It's amazing how this one body of water touches upon almost every major global issue. But with all these challenges, are there also opportunities? Is there a silver lining?
Oh, absolutely. The Indian Ocean has so much potential. Think about all the untapped renewable energy resources, the possibilities for new trade routes. There's so much to explore and use for the benefit of the region and the world. Imagine what could happen if countries work together to develop these resources sustainably.
Okay, so challenges and opportunities. It sounds like the Indian Ocean is going to be a busy place in the years to come.
It definitely will. And for India, figuring out how to navigate all of this is a delicate balancing act. It needs a deep understanding of history, geography, economics, and international relations.
No pressure for our UPSC aspirants, right?
Well, the good news is we've just scratched the surface today. There's so much more to explore, and really understanding the Indian Ocean will pay off big time in your UPSC exams. Speaking of which, there's one more fascinating thing we need to talk about before we finish up: the growing importance of undersea communication networks.
Oh yeah, those undersea cables, they're like the internet's nervous system, carrying tons of data across the ocean floor, connecting continents. But why are they so important for the Indian Ocean and, more importantly, for our UPSC preppers?
Here's what's fascinating and a little bit scary from a security perspective. Those cables aren't just about connecting people and sharing information anymore. They've become this strategic asset, a potential battleground for who controls technology.
Okay, now you've got me really interested. Tell me more. What's at stake here? Who's fighting for control, and why should we be worried?
Well, it used to be that European companies mostly managed these networks, but lately there's been a big shift with Chinese tech giants like Huawei getting involved, and that's where things get complicated.
Huawei, there's a name that always seems to be surrounded by controversy, especially when it comes to cybersecurity.
Exactly, and those concerns are even bigger when you're talking about undersea cables. Think about it, whoever controls those networks has access to a ton of data. That brings up all sorts of questions about national security, data privacy, and even economic espionage.
So it's not just about ships and trade routes anymore. The Indian Ocean is a battleground for technological dominance, too. That's a whole new game.
It is, and it brings us back to Alfred Thayer Mahan, that American naval strategist who said over 100 years ago that whoever controls the Indian Ocean basically controls global commerce and therefore global power.
His words are even more relevant today, aren't they? Especially with China rising and wanting to become a major maritime power.
They are, and this is exactly why initiatives like the Indian Ocean Conference and India's SAGAR are so important. They show that countries need to work together to make sure the Indian Ocean region develops peacefully and sustainably, because honestly, no single country can solve these problems on their own.
So it's about finding that balance between national interests and working together. But how do we even start to understand all these competing interests and challenges?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's something our UPSC aspirants are going to have to wrestle with as they learn more about this topic, because understanding the Indian Ocean isn't just an option anymore, it's essential.
Well said. And I think this is the perfect time to move on to our final thoughts. We've covered a lot today, from ancient history to cutting-edge technology. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Go ahead.
With everything we've discussed today, what role do you see India playing in the future of the Indian Ocean? It's a big question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
That's a question we should all be thinking about. India's role is going to depend on so many things, from what's happening within India to how geopolitics changes. But one thing's for sure, India is going to be even more involved in the Indian Ocean in the coming years.
Absolutely. So for our listeners, I encourage you to learn more about this topic, look at different perspectives, and most importantly, form your own opinions. After all, that's what the UPSC is all about.
And don't forget to stay up to date on what's happening in the Indian Ocean. You can find more information in the Indian Express editorial we've linked in the show notes. Definitely check it out.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts on India's role in the Indian Ocean. We want to hear from you.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
It's crazy to think something as basic as internet cables could be at the center of this whole geopolitical struggle. What's the average UPSC aspirant supposed to do with all this information?
Yeah, it's a lot to process. That's where critical thinking comes in. Remember, the UPSC isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about analyzing information, making connections, and forming strong arguments.
So how can our listeners apply that critical thinking to this issue specifically? Where should they focus?
I'd say there are a few key areas. First, understanding the technical stuff. What exactly are undersea cables? How do they work? What are their weaknesses?
Okay, so that's the tech side. What about the geopolitical side of things?
That's where it gets really interesting. You have to figure out what's motivating the different players. Why is China putting so much money into these networks? What does it mean for India's national security? How can India counter those moves while also looking out for its own interests in the region?
And we can't forget about the economic side. Whoever controls these cables has a big advantage when it comes to data flow and digital trade.
Exactly. It's all connected: technology, geopolitics, economics. It's the perfect example of how the UPSC syllabus plays out in the real world.
It's like a real-life case study happening right now, and it shows why staying up to date on current events is so important for doing well on the UPSC. Speaking of which, I want to remind everyone that we've linked to the India Express editorial that inspired this whole deep dive in our show notes. It's a great place to start your research.
Absolutely. And feel free to share your own thoughts and analysis in the comments. We love hearing from our listeners and having these thought-provoking conversations.
Exactly. We're all in this UPSC journey together, so let's learn from each other and support each other along the way.
So to all our future diplomats and civil servants out there, keep diving deep, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, never stop learning.
Until next time, good luck with your prep, and remember, the Indian Ocean is waiting to be explored.